Hi, everyone. Welcome to this discussion of the film Jahaji Music, India and the Caribbean from 2007. It's part of the Stanford Global Studies Summer Film Festival, which has been conceived around the theme, Oceans That Unite Us and Divide Us. And today we are delighted to have with us the director of Jahaji Music, Surabhi Sharma, who is an independent filmmaker, has been making films since 2000, and is an associate professor of practice of film and new media at NYU Abu Dhabi. Welcome, Surabhi, from Abu Dhabi, where it's very early in the morning. It's 6:30 a.m.
Hi, thank you so much for having me and inviting me, although it's virtual, but
Right.
lovely to be here.
We're really excited to have you here. Some of us have taught this film before. I just taught it this past spring semester in a course called Caste, Sexuality, and Religion in Indian Media. And I had an Indo-Caribbean student in that class who was just so delighted and touched to have a film that is about the Indo-Caribbean diaspora, and that's not often included in courses on Indian media. And my own relationship to the film is marked by my relationship to the Caribbean. My first tenure track job was at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine in Trinidad. And I was fascinated by the kind of similarities and differences between India and parts of the Caribbean. And it's something I'm currently working on in my book. So selfishly, I have a lot of questions for you, but I hope this is for the audience. Please post your questions in the chat, in the Q&A, so we can pose them to Surabhi as we go along in this webinar format. But back to that student who was in my class, he was really struck by how the film itself kind of seems to convey the filmmaking crew's discovery of the Indian diaspora in the Caribbean. And so let's maybe start there. Let's start with you telling us about the making of this film. Was this your first visit to Jamaica and Trinidad, and how you kind of responded to this new location, what your expectations were, what you found, and how that influenced the kind of film you made?
Yeah, sure. So yes, this was my first trip to the Caribbean, and everybody on the crew, the cinematographer, sound recordist, the production assistant, for four of us, actually five, even for Ashish, it was the first trip to the Caribbean, Jamaica and Trinidad. Tejaswini Niranjana, who has a book and who is actually the one who initiated the project, was the only one who had a sense of familiarity and relationship with the place and the people. This is very unlike the way I normally film. I never take out the camera. This was my third film. In my first two films, I took out the camera after days, like weeks actually. My first film, I didn't have a camera. I had the economic means were not there. So it was a year of just soaking in this one space and community before I started shooting. And the second film was quite similar. So this was very unusual, but I had spent a year before the shoot, an entire year actually, doing what we would call secondary research. I basically sat in Tejaswini's personal library and went through books, went through music. This is, YouTube is still not, and internet is still not a space where one can just find everything. I'm talking about 2003, 2004 is when we shot the film. And we started shooting literally the day we landed after 24 hours of flying. Because we were greedy, we were anxious. I was very anxious because we knew we had 6 weeks. And I knew that I cannot afford to go back. So I was shooting in a way that was very unusual for me, in the sense of greed of getting everything rather than reflection of what am I doing. But of course, we had charted out a very elaborate itinerary, Teju and I had sort of in my head listed out all the places, people, things that we need to visit. And we had pretty much lined up most of the wish list. So we were, that's how we entered the space.
Okay. And for the audience who might be wondering about the book, the film crew for Jahaji Music was accompanying the scholar Tejaswini Niranjana, whose 2006 book is titled Mobilizing India, Women, Music and Migration Between India and Trinidad. And actually in the book, like the book, your film offers this kind of comparative perspective between what might be called two global South locations, right? And what was that experience like, being part of this group of kind of cultural theorists, filmmakers, encountering the Caribbean in this way? And you first went to Jamaica, so that there is that question that comes up with a lot of people who watch the film. What is the connection between the Jamaica and Trinidad sections, and what were your own responses to it, to both of these locations?
So I'll start with the question about the collaboration with Tejaswini, whom I'm going to keep referring to as Teju. That's the name that most people know her by. So, you know, a year before we filmed, Teju approached me, and she was, in a sense, giving her finishing touches to her manuscript at that point. And she had basically, while writing the book, and it came out of that whole, in academia there was a whole project of South-South collaborations. In the spirit of that, she actually reached out to this pop rock musician, partly independent but partly with one foot in the Hindi film industry, with a lot of hits in the Hindi film industry, but very, very protective about his own independent musician, alternative musician kind of space. And she reached out to him because she felt that a lot of his own music seemed to be very with faint similarities to Calypso. And so she reached out to him and asked if he would go on this journey with her to Jamaica and Trinidad and see if the same kind of South-South collaboration conversations could happen in the realm of music and music production, not just musicians talking, but perhaps even a music. It was quite an audacious idea, even now when I look back. But at that point, I remember she approached me saying, he's agreed and I'm doing this journey with him. Would you like to document the journey? So she had actually started with the thought that it would be nice to document the journey. And I read her manuscript and I said, this is a film, Teju. This is not me coming with my camera and, doing some kind of edit of the highlights of this trip. And she was game and she was very open. Her manuscript, in a sense, provided the frame for me to embark on my own film. That was really, Teju and my collaborations are really very, very, very generative for me, because we are always discussing the intellectual frame within which one is sort of making sense of material, but the film remains my domain. There is no such thing as that, oh, but this chapter of mine is not represented in fact, I left the book altogether because, as you said, this was equally our journey into the Caribbean. Not just Remo's journey, not just Teju and Remo's journey, but equally my journey of sort of making sense, dismantling my filmic practice of knowing a space and feeling, obviously never an insider, but not feeling so much like an outsider. Here, the reminder that one was an outsider and that things were unfamiliar was like minute to minute, because so much of it is incomprehensible. So that was an interesting experience. And so yeah, my experience of being there, maybe you might want to ask more specific questions, because otherwise I'll just launch into a very long description.
Which is fascinating. And that is why we love having these discussions with the filmmakers, because when we watch the film and read the book alongside in a classroom, students do recognize they're two very different things. And one of the things that the film captures is this kind of sensory experience of the music. And you have made other films where music and migration are really central. Music is central to telling stories of migration. including a recent film, Bidesia and Bombay. And so these are two films for me that speak to each other in terms of this kind of migration of a Bhojpuri speaking migrant population often from Bihar and parts of Uttar Pradesh. So maybe tell us a little bit more about what the music did to the film itself as a formal influence.
Sure. Sorry, I realize I missed answering that one part
We
of
can
your
go to
question
the
about
Jamaica,
Jamaica.
Trinidad question later.
Let's do that first and then come to the music question, because it really it unfolds and unpeels in that way.
Okay.
So you know, the music question will keep coming up, but okay, let's foreground with the music. So we knew that this was going to be a film on music. This was my first film working with music. In fact, and in my documentaries before that, I was most reluctant to use even a small bit of music in those films as background or whatever. But this was a film on music. It was inhabiting that space of music performance, reflecting on the space of music production and performance. So I knew we were going to be visiting only music spaces primarily. In when we were doing the itinerary and we were going to be starting with Jamaica, at that point, even I was asking the question, okay, so why Jamaica? Because Teju's book is primarily based in Trinidad. So what Teju thought might be interesting, and we never knew if Jamaica would be in the film for the longest time. So Teju felt that Jamaica was so much part of her journey to Trinidad. And that being in Jamaica is what, at one level, opened up the idea of the Caribbean and its history. At the same time, it became the vantage point from which she was able to see the familiar and the unfamiliar in her initial. So she actually continued to say at that point that, you know, even if this film is only about Trinidad, that experience of Jamaica is essential. Otherwise, it is too easy to make a trip to Trinidad and claim the familiar as, oh, I know this. So her conceptual idea was, we have to unsettle the familiar through a journey through Jamaica. The other reason, and the very important reason, was that if we are looking at the musical sphere, to really understand the musical sphere in Trinidad, you have to understand the Caribbean musical sphere, and Jamaica becomes a very important part of that large puzzle. I would have loved to, if we had the funds, to also go to Guyana and other places. But then, given what we had, this seemed possible and important. When we were filming in Jamaica, it was, as you can imagine, and it's there even in the way I've edited the music, it was intense, it was overwhelming, and it's sort of, you are just enveloped. There was no time to process anything when we were in Jamaica. It was also a shorter trip, very fruitful, very, very productive. But it really did what Teju was hoping it would do. So that by the time we reached Trinidad, we were not willing to sort of say, I know this, including Hindi film music. Because suddenly even Hindi film music is not the Hindi film music that we know, right? Not just because of the sound of it, but because of the way the relationship with it is totally a different beast. But while editing the film, for the longest time, I wasn't touching Jamaica because it was totally messing up my, any structure. I was like, I don't know. And in a lot of our discussions when we were there, amongst the crew and Teju and Ashish and George and, Ramani, Suresh, at one level, we kept saying, oh my God, Jamaica has to be mixed up with Trinidad. It has to be like a Caribbean film. At other levels, we were like, okay, this makes no sense. We'll have to stick to Trinidad. So the easier route when I was editing, and just to let you know, we shot for 6 weeks. I came back, I had a kid, and I started editing 1.5 years after the Trinidad trip. And it took me more than a year to edit. It was a very long process of finally making sense of what we experienced in those 6 weeks. It was at that point in time that Jamaica became important for the film. And I'll give you a very small example about why. So when I started editing the way I had planned before we went to Jamaica and Trinidad, which was, I thought we would start from South Trinidad, which is where the East Indian population is, which is where the first ship landed. And I said, from there, we will go towards the north. And it makes sense. It's such a, it will be understandable to an audience outside of the Caribbean, especially in India. And when I was working on that edit, it was a friend of mine, a historian actually, who had I'd invited to see my cut. And she said, oh, this is beautiful, but Surabhi, you have ended up creating a nostalgic story of longing and belonging of a home that has been lost, and that hit me that, gosh, if one is not careful, it is so easy to create a false narrative. And it's such a dubious narrative, right?
Yes.
It is the narrative that an Indian would want to impose on Trinidad. And I immediately, though it was very compelling and very soulful and all of that, precisely for that reason, I scrapped that edit, went back to why did we shoot in Jamaica? And it suddenly became clear that unless right at the beginning, we have the dancehall queen, Stacey, dancing in the streets in Jamaica, when we see the old women dancing around the wedding fire in an Hindu wedding, that has to color our experience and understanding of that. Not that, oh, in Bihar and in East UP and in North India, women sing, saucy songs and double meaning songs and dance audaciously, right? So one had to break that, I know this moment. So that's why long answer for the Jamaica angle.
No, but this is a way for you to actually tell us how you crafted the film and how many years after the experience you were returning to it as well. And these are really fraught questions in the Caribbean of disrupting this kind of belonging or longing and nostalgia for a lost homeland, because all of the politics in many parts of the Caribbean, Guyana, especially Guyana, and then in parts of Trinidad, is about kind of African versus Indian heritage, political parties being split along these lines of East Indian, West Indian, all of that. So one would have to be careful about this. And the narrative often is that in Jamaica, the Indo-Caribbean indentured diaspora was kind of assimilated into an Afro-Jamaican culture. So I think what the film does is interesting. We have an audience question about that. A member from the audience says, was the idea of juxtaposing Jamaica and Trinidad to highlight the Indian presence in the latter in Trinidad and how the music traditions are different as a result?
It was not to juxtapose necessarily the Indian presence. Of course, that does happen. But as I said, it was a way of, it was an important way to understand the musical and political culture, like both Jamaica and Trinidad, politics is being played out in the musical sphere. So it was an important way to sort of historicize a bunch of things. I think it was important, although it's not directly there in Trinidad, but the Black Power movement, the entire what's happening in the 60s in Jamaica politically, how it's sort of impacting the music, became an important way to enter the musical sphere in Trinidad. Very different, contemporary politics, very, very different, but in a sense also connected to the colonial histories. 400 years of Babylon is chanted in Jamaica, but it is such an important presence in Trinidad. And as you rightly said, it is the way for the politics and politicians to sort of separate the Indian and the Afro Trinidadian communities, the East Indian communities and the Afro Trinidadian communities. So it was important to reference all of that. The other thing that, now to come back to your music question, the other reason why it was important was not just to show the Indian presence in the music in Trinidad, but to sort of really chart a journey through the way the music sounds from Jamaica to North Trinidad to South Trinidad. Literally, we were editing to very dense, intense kind of rhythms to a much more melodious kind of inflection coming in by the time you reach the Bhojpuri folk song. You know, so there's an affect to the music that is also constantly shifting, and that became in a sense, the spine with which to decide what part comes where. So in North Trinidad, in the beginning of the Trinidad sequences, we have a singer like Ataclan and Three Canal, who are very influenced by dance hall, right? And it's only then that you reach Sparrow, and then, you know, so there was a way in which we were trying to work that out. But yes, of course, it inadvertently talks about the Indian presence in the music, but that was not its only function.
Right. And before we move to a question from the audience, I did want to ask you about something that my students notice as well, how you edit. We start with Cecil Fundrose, I think, in Trinidad, singing beautifully in a mix of Bhojpuri, Creole, English. But then you cut as he's singing and speaking to these kind of abandoned, grown over cane fields. And we see a sign which says, "Cane is our life." And to me, it brings up multiple questions about the landscape being written over with these multiple histories of labor migration, right? Of enslavement, of indenture, of multiple communities, African, Chinese, Portuguese, Indian, etc. So if you wanted to tell us a little bit about the editing pattern of the film, the music is clearly a major influence on that. But the presence of landscape, moving shots, and then we'll go to the question in the chat.
So, I was working with a cinematographer. This was the first time I was working with him, who's also a filmmaker, and whose work I admire deeply, Ramani. And Ramani is always shooting. So it used to drive me crazy at that time that, you know, I have limited, we are still shooting in DV tapes at that time. Like, I have limited tapes. I actually carried, I think, 120 tapes, which is unbelievable at that time also. And even now, I'm amazed by what we were doing. But I kept being, you know, stingy that if I run out of tapes, it will be a disaster because I don't know where to get them over here. But every time we were traveling, Ramani would be rolling, also because we were always jumping from place to place to place, person to person, performance to performance. And he was, I think, feeling like, Surabhi, you know, we can't just be jumping like that. You need material, but also because that's his way of engaging with the space through the camera and when it's recording. So something that was entirely his initiative, actually. It was not something that I asked for, except when we were passing by these, you know, abandoned sugarcane fields and the train, the abandoned train. That was the only time we actually stopped because I said, we have to shoot this. So, but when I was editing, again, to come back to something that you and I spoke about earlier, music was not meant to be an illustrative tool for the film. That XYZ expert says this genre happened because of this political event, and so on and so forth. It was meant to be through music, one would comprehend a certain sense of history, without it being sort of spelt out in a neat and clean way. So the moment music became central, music has its own rhythm, and you can't escape that. You have to sort of stay with that when you are editing your visuals. Visuals can't do its own thing, and have overlay music so that it becomes a kind of background score. So that was when I actually went to these landscape shots and found a way to sort of extend the impact of the music. So you never feel like you've left a performance. You never feel like you've left the studio, because one sort of kept on unfolding the music through the landscape, and often that rhythm of our vehicle passing through became quite evocative. For me, particularly the moment where I felt like magic had happened is when my sound designer, Mohan Das, again, someone who I worked with for the first time in this film, there's a shot of it's raining and the wiper of the car, and we are sort of going through the streets of Port of Spain. And in that, when we were doing the sound mix, he put the sound of the wiper, and that became, in a sense, the metronome rhythm for what's playing in the background. It sort of leads into the studio. So landscape just got completely, it became the via media. Instead of cutting to a person explaining what we have just heard, it became a far more evocative way of sort of inhabiting that space. Yeah. And you'll see that very little of that happens in Jamaica, because the music there sort of asks for a very different way to visualize it.
Right. And that the landscape and music are very racially coded, at least in Trinidad, that, the Indo-Caribbean population is often seen as rural in places, San Fernando, Caroni, and Port of Spain and La Ventil are the places for calypso, steel, the big pan bands, all of that, right? So urban and rural are also kind of marked as politically, racially marked. So, and I think the film brings that up for anyone who knows those landscapes.
Yeah, and we were very particular about matching the right landscape to the right music. Right. One didn't mess that up, I think.
Right. Absolutely, because they have huge, very, very deep valences in these places. Yeah. We have a question from Anjali Arandekar, a common friend. Says, hi, Surabhi and Usha, enjoying this Guftagu very much, especially after having also taught the film. My question is, how did these engagements with migration sound? And as you said, a critical dis-ease with longing or recuperation translate in your newer work? I'm thinking of your recent Fir Se Sampe Aana, which, while not diasporic in the same sense, is also about space, memory, and the celebration of music, and of migrant communities and displacement.
So thanks, Anjali, for this question. Anjali actually is interviewed in the film that she mentions. This film, and now to really address your music question, Usha, in a much more singular way, this film did a lot of things for me. One is that it really changed my formal concerns quite dramatically. I went on immediately after Jahaji Music, after finishing Jahaji Music, I began researching and working on the Bhojpuri migrant community in Mumbai. And at that point in time, it was literally at the time that I was working on this film, the right-wing Raj Thakre's party, MNS, started coming up with this, this new rhetoric that the Bhojpuri migrant is the problem of the city. He's the outsider and he's the one messing up the city. And the BMC came up with this figure that 1 in every 4 migrant worker is Bhojpuri. So this was then, this figure was built up as this threat to the Mumbai-karness of Mumbai. Yeah, like, you know, the son of the soil is now threatened. So it was quite organic for me to then now look at the migrant Bhojpuri worker in Mumbai. And that led to my film Videsia in Mumbai, where again it was the Bhojpuri music and the way it had crossed over into popular music production, and very, you know, like these, like sweatshop production, like these studios in this tiny one room place in the middle of a slum. And the thing that music again became really an important vehicle is that there's a way in which interviews do carry an affect, but there's a way in which music carries affect that completely muddies the water. And that is something that I found compelling. In any case, I never have a clear narrative. I'm actually opposed to clear narratives. Music allowed me to make it even more ambiguous, so that there are lots of ideas that are thrown up and a lot of emotions thrown up, but it doesn't neatly tie together, because in real life it doesn't. Coming to the film, so that was Videsia and Mumbai. And then again, Tejo and I embarked on a collaboration where we looked at communities from Goa and communities from the north that came to Bombay at, you know, in the early part of the 20th century or even before, when capital was in Mumbai and when princely states are dying out, and they come to Bombay. So they are musicians who and dancers who carry their art, right? So this is the Kalavant community from Goa, or the you know, the Tawayef communities, or the Muslim ustads from the north. So they are all sort of migrating to Mumbai, which is one where, you know, where the money is. So the patrons are there. It's also the burgeoning, you know, the music industry, the recording companies are there. They are, of course, in Calcutta, but they're also in Bombay. A lot of baithaks are being organized, you know, by wealthy traders. So there's that migration coming into the city. And the film actually looks at the spaces of where music was performed, taught, or where musicians stayed. So we were looking at one particular area in Mumbai, and in that space we were trying to create a sense, and I tried very hard without stating it, to create a sense of the absences, because today Hindustani classical music is almost empty of there's very less of a presence of it's basically taken over a lot by the upper caste, you know, Hindus, where it's become really like their music. And the history, even barely 50 years ago, in fact, the music has been sustained and nourished over centuries through communities that were always, in a sense, you know, marginalized. So they were the ones who nourished the music, and it grew. And today these spaces are silent, because obviously in that area people have moved to other suburbs. It's a very congested area, but those empty spaces spoke to me about erasures and absences. So it was looking at migrant communities who actually built that part, you know, it's you know, as in fact in a clip from Anjali's interview, there's something said about how the women from the community were buying up property. That was the most important kind of you know, way to store your money, to save your money, right? So that area, but today it actually you know, you don't see the presence of the community at all, for a variety of reasons. It's complex, so I won't get into that. But here again, music, in fact, an absence of music. I had a lot of archival recordings of these spaces, which I chose not to keep in the film because it becomes, again, to come back to Jahaji music, music becomes an easy way to inhabit a space. And if you don't want the audience to inhabit a space easily, like in this film, you need to really be very, very miserly with it. So I don't know if this answers Anjali's question, but I just thought we could segue back to Jahaji music.
Yes, but it also is an invitation to the audience to watch Surabhi's other films, which are all very generously available for free on her website, which is part of it's on the link on the Stanford Center for South Asia webpage. Actually, these questions about gender and caste are so central to discussions in the Caribbean now as well. And the film, like Tejaswini's book, is kind of dealing through figures like Drupadi and Denise Belfon with the question of gender and women's performance in relation to politicized questions of Blackness, of East Indianness, etc. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that. You take us to Calypso, Mighty Sparrow's song Maharajin. There are these earlier and later periods, and there are very particular ways in which East Indian women are figured differently than East Indian men. And so gender remains a kind of critical line. Caste is being articulated more recently. And you have right-wing figures in Trinidad like Satmaraj, who actually would, tell Indo-Caribbean folks not to go to Drupadi's concerts, who would ban dancing, grinding, whining at chutney concerts. So these are parts, the film is also pointing us just briefly to these multiple negotiations that are happening in parts of the Caribbean, especially in Trinidad and Guyana.
Yeah. So here again, I'll come back to Jamaica being important, and especially that clip, that part of the interview with Carolyn Cooper. I think one of the few interviews which are there to, in a sense, explain, but not only because Carolyn Cooper herself becomes such a presence in the film. So she's not just there to sort of give her expert opinion, but also her absolutely wonderful presence. So that again becomes an important frame to get to Trinidad, to think about women and women performers and what's going on there. And as you said, and Drupadi says in her interview that I was the first woman to get on to the Calypso stage, and that was unacceptable. And then, we see that, so we were there in 2004, and Denise Belfon talks about the controversy of 2003, where she, as an Afro-Trinidadian woman performer, talks about the Indian man, and it becomes such a problem. Right. And for me, it was important then. It was pure serendipity, but it was really important that while Denise's song is playing, I cut to the what was it called? The Hindu Cultural Center, sort of playing that song 1 year later, after they were trying to get it banned, and there was all this controversy around it, and everyone's dancing to it like they would to Maharajin or any of Drupadi's songs, right? So at that point in time, caste was this question that we could see quite clearly, but at that point in Trinidad, it was not being articulated in that sense. So I feel, in retrospect, that the caste question is very muted in my film. For those who know the space, it is visible, but for those who don't, I'm not sure how visible it is. But I didn't know how to sort of bring those layers out without then stating it. And we had this wonderful interview with a historian who talks about the Brahmin by boat. That whole history of now finally we are in a space where that journey allows you to shed wherever you are from and whoever you are, right? And then again, the presence of women, and women are brought in at a much later stage. So all of that, it's a beautiful interview, but it just felt like I was plopping it in. And as I said, I was trying to be very mindful of what are the narratives emerging through the music. So yeah, it is, I think, a bit too muted in the film when I look at it today. But I know I was grappling with it. So those tensions, as someone like you who's familiar with the place, you can read into it. But yeah, I feel that that's something that's somehow missing.
And there is now a lot more scholarship by Indo-Caribbean scholars, especially on caste and race. And for those in the audience who are interested in thinking further about gender, there's Gayatri Bahadur's excellent book, Coolie Woman, which also talks about the kind of negotiations of caste and women, especially women who came as indentured laborers, and these kinds of narratives, and often through song is how these are being expressed. We have a little bit of time left. Let's go to Remo Fernandez, who Tejaswini writes about a little bit in the book as well. But I think the film makes very clear the kind of tensions. There are references to, we have some of this in Goa as well, where he is from. So there are those interesting connections to think about these multiple diasporas, multiple kind of residues and kind of colonialisms across these locations. But there is also his very marked disdain for Hindi film music with Ricky Jay and other people in his studio. I love that one line. There's somebody in Ricky Jay's studio who says, we may not understand the words, but we feel them because it's a part of we. And Remo has, and he has recorded and composed Hama Hama for... what Mani Ratnam's film? Bombay, yeah, just a few years before that. But there is a difference in how Remo Fernandez is interacting with the Afro-Trinidadian and the Afro-Jamaican musicians and the Indo-Caribbean ones. And this also speaks to some of the tensions that Indo-Caribbean performers feel with Indian performers and people who go from India to engage with them. There's always a sense of they're always related as the diaspora to the homeland, with very little conversation about how their performance cultures have actually influenced Indian popular culture. And then you have Gangs of Wasepur, you have a music composer like Sneha Khanwalkar who goes to Trinidad to pick, chutney music for the film. So these two traffics are actually so important. But your film, Jahaji Music, actually marks an earlier moment, and Remo Fernandez is an interesting figure, I think, for that.
Yeah. So Remo was interesting again at many levels. One, for me as a documentary filmmaker, I was finding it very hard because he was placed. He was artificially placed. In a sense, he was like an actor, because this was not normal for him to go there, right? It was, and as a documentary filmmaker, especially my previous works, I was so much about, no outside, I have to sort of go to that space and observe that space and people in that space. So I was as a filmmaker itself very anxious about what is this going to be, because I knew this was not going to be a film on Remo's journey. That was not my intention to begin with, but he was very much part of the narrative. So and we didn't know. It was a blank card. Like, I didn't know in advance that how it's going to turn out. So it was interesting, very, very fraught. But in retrospect, again, while editing the film, I could sort of tease out a lot of these layers, because again, I had the option. It wasn't as if Teju had said you have to have Remo in the film. I had the option of editing him out, and I could have actually made a fantastic film with all the kind of material I had. But Remo actually became the presence for this not to become a kind of National Geographic film on the music of Jamaica and Trinidad. Not that I would have been capable of making that kind of film, because that's not the kind of film I make, but you know what I mean. So Remo was actually constantly the figure that was upsetting things that were playing out in front of my camera. And so then the question while editing is, what is this tension? So, and there's so many multiple layers to that. There is Remo, who's always trying to disassociate from Indian colonialism, saying, I am Goan. So I am a different being altogether, right? We were colonized by the Portuguese. So leave me out of that, the British colonized all of us kind of conversation. So there was that. There was him wanting to really very closely guard his space and identity as a rock pop musician. And so he always says, I'm not a musician who does Bollywood music. When Bollywood requires my sound is when they reach out to me, which is correct. He is absolutely correct. So he refused to be sort of seen as an extension of Hindi film music. Now in Trinidad, India is Hindi film music. So in fact, in Trinidad, the fact that our motley group of 6 people, I was the only actual North Indian Hindi speaking person, was something I was like, what the hell does that even mean? Like, what does it mean that in the group there's someone named George Joes? That's a Trinidadian name, So there was so for when Remo was interacting with musicians, especially in Trinidad, there was a sense that he is the singer of Hamma Hamma. He is the singer, Pyar To Hona Hi Tha. So he is, we understand each other. And Remo constantly wanted to give the vibe that, no, we don't. I don't get why sitting here in the middle of such amazing music, you are actually harking back to and feel a connection to what he considered absolutely awful music. And so that tension, in a sense, I think was something that one could play out beyond it becoming personalities, because of course there are personality issues as well. You and I might be able to collaborate, me and the third person is not able to collaborate. So it was a very thin line that I had to sort of follow, where it doesn't become about personalities, but becomes about these histories are not easily understandable and recognizable. It's not so simple as a musician from Trinidad and Jamaica and India sit together. In fact, that is what counters this world music idea, that I can take a drum from Korea, I can take a flute from somewhere else, and we can make this groovy music, because music knows no boundaries. But musics have histories, and music so cannot speak to each other so effortlessly. And that became really the important element that Remo brought into the film.
And that becomes very evident in the multiple jamming sessions, right? Whether it's in Jamaica, whether it's with Steel Pan, whether it's with Denise and with Ricky. So these are very different jamming sessions to which he is bringing a different energy, and each of them is bringing a different imagination of India, what the exposure of this, their music to an Indian audience might do for their fame and all of that. So very interesting. If we don't have any further questions from the audience, I did want to ask, what have responses to this film been in India, in other parts, in the Caribbean, if you have
so in the
responses? Because growing up in India, at least I wasn't ever taught in school about indenture and this long history. So until I was going to leave for Trinidad, this was just a very fuzzy kind of hazy thing. And what I love about the film is it actually brings to the fore the messiness of these connections and disconnections.
Yeah. So the film has been screened in Trinidad. I don't think it's been screened in Jamaica, though I had sent it to Carolyn Cooper. I think this was when we were still sending VHS tapes and couriering them. But I wasn't present in any of the screenings, so I don't know. I do know that I recently screened the film in my university in NYU Abu Dhabi. And the first time it was screened in the screening room, there was a student who reached out to me who was from Trinidad. And like your student, could not believe that a film from her country like, she's like, nobody talks about we are so small that it's invisible. So she was delighted. But there was another screening in a colleague's ethnomusicology class, which also had a Trinidadian student. And for her, this film was just this alien beast, because she said, I don't know any of the musicians you're talking about, because it's already almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So that came as a shock, that, it shouldn't come as a shock, because in Trinidad, there's music is so alive that you have new singers every season. So for her, it was like, who are these people? So she found it like this curious object. And I found both these responses very interesting. The film's been screened a lot in the US and in India, basically universities setups in India, through festivals, through screenings. The most and it's been really well received, actually. The most interesting screening that I had of Jahaji Music was when this fantastic group in India that screens, that hosts festivals in small towns across UP, MP, and Rajasthan. They began at Gorakhpur. So they have something called the Gorakhpur Film Festival. And one of the organizers of that festival had seen one of the early screenings of my film. And he said, I will screen this film in Gorakhpur, which is where, this is East UP, which is where a lot of the migration came from. And I want to do a Hindi kind of translation. So we actually spent a year trying to do Hindi subtitles. And I just said, I don't even know how. He was taking the initiative. I said, I don't know how you're going to do it. I think it's almost impossible, but I don't know if the subtitling happened, but they did do a lot of para dubbing, and they did a lot of screenings in East UP. And I was there for some, and it was quite a moment for me, because, again, as you said, these histories, even in that region, they are there in oral narratives and oral histories, but it's not there anywhere on record. Like, this is something we don't know. So it became this thing that really animated the audience in spectacular ways. And yeah, this film has had quite a life, actually, without me realizing how that happened.
This reception history would be really fascinating to track. There is an Indo-Caribbean poet, scholar, Rajiv Mahabir. His memoir, Anti-Man, talks about, he's Indo-Guyanese, talks about going to study Hindi in UP and then going to this village that he imagines is where his ancestors came from, and music being the connecting kind of force between what this family that invited him and insisted that he was, part of their family, all of that. So I think the title is very apt of the film, and it continues to have resonances for people. Thank you so much, Surabhi, for joining us this early in the morning. And thank you to all of you who came to this discussion. I hope you'll watch more of Surabhi's films and return for the rest of the Summer Film Festival. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here, Usha.
Of course. Yeah, thanks.